They thought he was gone forever. The words hung in the air like smoke drifting over a battlefield long abandoned. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the old clearing, the autumn wind tugging at the hem of his jacket, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth. The sky was a muted gray, the kind that promised rain but delivered only a cold drizzle, settling on the fallen leaves and puddled mud with a quiet persistence. Ahead of him, the white German shepherd, Blizzard, lay still beside the weathered cross, its edges splintered and gray with age, a monument to the soldiers who had fallen decades before. The grass around the cross was flattened, damp, and pressed down by time and neglect, and Ethan could hear the distant call of crows settling into the skeletal branches of surrounding oaks, their cries echoing like forgotten voices. He bent slightly, brushing his gloved hand against the ground, feeling the cold seep through the leather, and he remembered the first time Blizzard had chosen him, months after his last deployment, on a quiet, ordinary street that had suddenly felt like the only place left in the world that made sense. The memory was vivid, every detail etched in the corners of his mind. Blizzard's amber eyes, alert yet patient, waiting as if he had known Ethan longer than anyone. The way the wind carried the faint scent of the city's river into that empty lot, and the subtle tremble of the dog's muscles that had seemed to signal both caution and trust. Now, years later, here he was, staring down at the same unwavering loyalty, distilled into a silent stillness beside a forgotten cross, and the world around them seemed suspended, a tableau of quiet grief and unspoken devotion. The leaves rustled softly, a whispering reminder that life continued even in spaces abandoned by men, and Ethan shifted his weight, boots pressing into the soft mud, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement beyond the fog trailing. Every shadow seemed elongated, every droplet of mist refracted in the muted light, forming a landscape that was almost otherworldly, as if the forest itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Blizzard's fur, white with the faintest streaks of gray along his back, caught the low light in a way that made him look ethereal, a spirit of the battlefield past, his breathing shallow yet steady, a rhythm Ethan had come to know as the heartbeat of persistence, of hope against all odds. The cross beneath which Blizzard lay carried its own history. Carved names, chipped edges, moss creeping along its surface, telling stories of men who had trusted each other with their lives and of battles whose echoes remained in the soil and stone. Ethan knelt slowly, feeling the wetness of the earth press through his gloves, the smell of decay and rain mixing with the faint metallic tang of old bullets and rusted insignias nearby, and he whispered, almost to himself, "I won't leave you behind." A sudden gust lifted the hair along Blizzard's neck, making the dog's ears twitch, alert, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a faint bark cut through the damp morning air, sharp yet tentative, a signal that stirred the stillness. Ethan's heart thumped in his chest, a rhythm echoing the urgency in Blizzard's bark, as if the sound carried more than noise, an unseen message, a pulse bridging the years of separation and silence. He leaned closer, hand hovering above Blizzard's head, feeling the quiet heat radiate from the dog's body, sensing the latent energy waiting to be released. Around them, the clearing remained hushed, the drizzle forming tiny rivulets in the grooves of the earth, the skeletal trees swaying as though in anticipation, and the faint outline of a path led deeper into the forest, shrouded in mist and shadow. Ethan rose slightly, boots squelching in the mud, eyes never leaving Blizzard, knowing that whatever had happened before, whatever secrets the old battlefield still held, was about to unfold. Blizzard lifted his head just a fraction, amber eyes locking with Ethan's, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink, the clearing and the cross and the mist collapsing into the singular certainty of loyalty and recognition, a silent pact renewed. The sound of the bark echoed again, more confident now, carrying with it an unspoken warning and a promise, vibrating through the damp air and into the marrow of the trees themselves, stirring something long dormant. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension coiling in his shoulders beginning to ease, replaced by a solemn anticipation, as though the very forest waited with him. Every detail, the slick leaves underfoot, the chill pressing through his jacket, the faint metallic scent of the cross, The subtle shiver along Blizzard's spine formed a tapestry of presence, grounding them both in the moment, in the connection that had always transcended words. He bent down again, brushing a hand along Blizzard's back, feeling the coarse fur, and whispered softly, "You're here. You're really here." And for the first time, the morning seemed alive, the fog lifting just enough to reveal glimpses of sunlight threading through the branches, illuminating the dog, the cross, and the man who had never stopped believing that loyalty could bridge even the longest shadows of time. The bark had woken something older than memory itself. Ethan Walker took a cautious step forward, boots sinking slightly into the damp leaves, and the mist curling around his ankles as if to guide him deeper into the clearing. Blizzard lifted his head higher now, ears pricked, eyes scanning the treeline with the precision of a sentinel who had seen far too much yet trusted far too little. The air was sharp with the scent of wet pine needles and the faint metallic tang of old brass, and every droplet of drizzle that landed on Ethan's jacket seemed to carry a weight of history, pressing the silence around them into a tangible form. As he moved, his gloved hand brushed against the splintered bark of a nearby oak, grounding him, reminding him that he was here, alive, and that Blizzard was real, breathing, waiting, signaling. The forest around them remained hushed, the skeletal limbs of trees bending under the soft rhythm of the wind, and somewhere beyond the veil of fog, the distant gurgle of a stream whispered like a half-forgotten memory. Ethan's heart thumped steadily, a measured rhythm he relied on in every tense moment since returning from deployment, and it was mirrored in the subtle rise and fall of Blizzard's chest as the dog shifted slightly. Sniffing the damp air, every hair on his back taut with awareness. The ground beneath them was uneven, fallen branches and hidden roots creating a lattice that demanded care with each step, yet Ethan felt no hesitation. He had learned over years of training to trust the instincts that Blizzard communicated without words. The amber eyes of the dog reflected the dim light filtering through the clouded canopy, glinting like embers caught in morning haze, and Ethan felt the same surge of recognition he had felt the first day they met, a connection that transcended language, crossing the years and distance of everything that had come before. The bark repeated, a single sharp note this time, clear, insistent, cutting through the fog like a signal flare, and Ethan followed, each step measured, attentive to the subtle cues Blizzard provided, the shift of weight, the angle of the head, the flick of an ear. Small birds stirred in the underbrush, startled into flight, their wings brushing against the fog as though tracing invisible patterns, and Ethan could feel the presence of the battlefield itself, old soil saturated with echoes of courage, endurance, and quiet sacrifice, a weight that pressed gently yet insistently on the shoulders of both man and dog. Blizzard began to move, slow, deliberate, leading Ethan along a narrow path formed from decades of forgotten footfalls, the drizzle slicking the leaves, but neither of them faltering. A silent conversation, passing in glances and subtle gestures, a language of trust built in the crucible of shared purpose. Ethan's thoughts drifted briefly to the nights spent in distant bases, when Blizzard had remained alert beside him through storms, through silence, through every threat that could not be spoken aloud, and he realized with a quiet ache that the same loyalty persisted here, even after so many seasons had passed. The mist parted slightly as they approached a low mound, subtle yet distinct in its rise from the earth, and Blizzard stopped, tail sweeping the ground once, eyes locking onto Ethan's as if to say, "This is the moment." Ethan knelt slowly, feeling the cold seep through his gloves, the mixture of damp soil and decaying leaves pressing into his palms, and he traced the contours of the mound with careful hands, uncovering the faint imprint of old rope, a tag partially obscured by dirt, and the unmistakable texture of fur pressed into the soil. A small sound, a shuffle of movement beneath the mound, quickened his pulse, yet he remained still, trusting Blizzard to guide him. The dog's posture remained taut but calm, a living compass pointing to the truth hidden in the layers of time, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe slowly, letting the mist mingle with the warmth radiating from Blizzard's body. Each detail, the slick leaves underfoot, the faint aroma of pine and wet earth, the subtle play of light on Blizzard's white coat, and the persistent echo of the bark, woven together created a sense of immediacy, a living tableau of recognition and suspense. Ethan's hand hovered above the soil, trembling slightly not from fear, but from the anticipation of reunion, and Blizzard's ears flicked, tail lifting, eyes glowing with that unmistakable combination of alertness and reassurance. The bark came once more, insistent and resonant, and in that precise instant, Ethan knew that the moments of the past were converging with the present, that Blizzard's presence was more than companionship. It was proof. It was signal. It was the silent affirmation of all the unspoken bonds that had led them here, to this clearing, to the mound, to the truth waiting to be acknowledged. He leaned forward fully now, tracing the outline of the hidden shape beneath the leaves, sensing the pulse of life, the solidity of presence, and the faint warmth that spoke louder than any words could convey, a testament to loyalty, perseverance, and the quiet miracles that unfold when patience, trust, and devotion are allowed to guide the way. The warmth beneath the leaves was small, but it was real. Ethan felt it through the thin barrier of his gloves, a faint living pulse hidden under damp earth and brown oak leaves. And for a moment, he could not move. The whole clearing seemed to lean toward him. The old cross stood behind his shoulder, gray and patient, its cracked wood beaded with rain, while Blizzard held his ground a few feet away, chest rising and falling with quiet urgency. The white K9 did not bark again. He only watched. That was the signal Ethan knew better than any command. Wait. Listen. Trust. Ethan brushed away the leaves with slow hands, careful not to disturb more than he had to, and the smell of wet soil lifted into the air, clean and heavy, mixed with pine sap and the cold breath of morning. Beneath the shallow covering, his fingers found cloth. Not a burial wrap. Not the kind of fabric used for ceremony. This was canvas, military green, folded with care and stained by rain. Ethan pulled it back an inch at a time, and there, half hidden under the muddy edge, was a collar. A white leather collar. Worn soft. Familiar. His throat tightened before his mind could form the words. The small brass plate was scratched, but the name still caught the gray light. Blizzard. For one impossible second, Ethan looked from the collar to the dog standing beside him, and the world split into silence. The dog before him was breathing, living, watching. Yet the collar in Ethan's hand had been the one taken from Blizzard after the report came in, the one they had told him was found near the Ridge Road 3 nights earlier, the proof that had made everyone lower their eyes and speak gently around him. Ethan's fingers closed around it, not in anger, but in disbelief so deep it felt almost holy. Blizzard stepped closer, nose lowering to the canvas, then to the collar, then to Ethan's hand. He gave a soft, broken whine, the kind that did not belong to fear. It belonged to recognition. Ethan swallowed hard. You knew, he whispered. The dog's amber eyes lifted. In them was no confusion, no panic, only the old steadiness, the same steadiness that had once guided Ethan through dark roads, through training fields, through sleepless nights when the world outside the window felt too loud. Ethan turned back to the canvas and uncovered more of what lay beneath. It was not a body. It was a pack. A standard field pack, old but intact, tucked carefully under the mound as if someone had meant it to stay hidden. The straps were muddy. One buckle was bent. A faded patch clung to the side, its stitching almost gone, but Ethan recognized the unit emblem immediately. His unit. His breath slowed. A strange calm moved through him now, sharper than fear, deeper than shock. The truth was not rising all at once. It was coming in pieces. A collar. A pack. A dog who had been declared gone but stood alive beside him. Blizzard nudged the pack with his nose, then stepped back, waiting. Ethan understood. He opened the flap. Inside, wrapped in a dry plastic sleeve, was a folded map, a small notebook, and a silver dog tag darkened by age and rainwater. Ethan lifted the tag first. It was not Blizzard's. It belonged to a Marine named Aaron Hayes, a name Ethan had heard spoken in old base stories. Always quietly, always with reverence, a Marine who had vanished during a training recovery mission near this same forgotten battlefield years before Ethan had ever been assigned there. No one had known exactly what happened to him. The official words had been simple. Lost in severe weather. Search concluded. Ethan looked toward the tree line, where fog moved in pale ribbons between the trunks. The morning suddenly felt wider, filled with unseen roads and unfinished prayers. Blizzard turned his head toward the narrow path beyond the mound and gave one low breath through his nose, almost a sigh, then walked 3 steps forward and stopped. Ethan followed his gaze. Beyond the path, half covered by vines and fallen branches, something pale marked the ground. Not bone, not danger. Stone. A second cross, smaller than the first, almost swallowed by the earth. Ethan rose slowly, the pack in one hand and the collar in the other, and followed Blizzard. Each step made the wet leaves whisper under his boots. The drizzle softened. Somewhere overhead, a crow lifted from a branch and disappeared into the mist. When Ethan reached the smaller cross, he saw words carved shallow into the wood at its base, nearly erased by weather. Not forgotten, just waiting. His eyes stung, but he did not wipe them. Blizzard sat beside the cross, tall and still, his white coat glowing against the dark ground like a candle in a room that had waited years for light. Ethan knelt again, placing Aaron Hayes's dog tag gently on the stone. He did not know the whole story yet, but he knew enough to understand that Blizzard had not led him to a grave. He had led him to a promise. And somewhere beneath that quiet promise was a truth someone had tried to bury under rain, leaves, and time. The forest seemed to exhale as Ethan Walker lifted his gaze from the small cross, the mist curling around the oaks like smoke caught in a forgotten chimney. Blizzard remained seated, tail resting lightly on the wet leaves, eyes locked on Ethan with an intensity that required no translation, no explanation beyond the bond they had shared through months of patrols, training drills, and silent nights under foreign stars. Ethan took a careful step forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, and the faint squelch of mud beneath his feet mingled with the distant rush of a creek hidden beyond the tree line, carrying the scent of rain and pine sap. He bent to retrieve the folded notebook from the pack, the leather worn in corners softened by time, and the faint metallic tang of the dog tag brushing against his fingers sent a shiver up his spine, a quiet reminder of how fragile yet resilient life could be. Blizzard rose slowly, fur glistening with the drizzle, and padded to the edge of the clearing, nose low, sniffing the air with measured patience, the soft woof of breath and faint scrape of claws on wet leaves marking the rhythm of an unspoken message. Ethan unfolded the notebook, rain droplets catching on the paper, making ink blur slightly, but leaving enough legibility for him to read the scrawled lines, words written in a deliberate hand that spoke of caution, remembrance, and a promise kept even when the world had seemed to have turned its back. He traced each word with a fingertip, feeling the impressions of the pen, the dedication of someone who had thought carefully about what would be left behind, and a sense of quiet awe filled him as he realized that Blizzard had guided him not only to the site, but to the exact proof, the exact token of continuity that bridged the past to the present. The wind shifted, stirring the damp leaves and lifting the mist higher into the branches, and Ethan felt the presence of time itself, folding over the clearing, wrapping them both in its soft, persistent embrace. Blizzard padded closer, brushing against Ethan's leg, and he knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears, the coarse fur damp and cool beneath his gloves, amber eyes meeting his with that steady, unwavering trust that had been forged long ago in moments too small to be remembered by anyone else, but vital enough to survive any distance or silence. The creek's faint babble seemed to echo the movement of thought in Ethan's mind, the questions he had carried for years, the uncertainty of reports, the letters that had never arrived, the silent absence that had pressed against him with every passing season. Now, in the hush of the clearing, the patter of drizzle on leaves, the faint shimmer of sunlight breaking through low clouds, the truth was tangible, resting in the collar, the tag, the notebook, and the patient presence of Blizzard, a living testament to persistence and fidelity. Ethan stood slowly, boots wet, coat clinging to his shoulders, and surveyed the scene, the damp forest floor, the 2 crosses, the mist curling like soft ribbons around the skeletal trunks, and he felt the gravity of all that had led him here, the vigilance, the patience, the quiet insistence of a companion who had never abandoned him. Blizzard barked once, short and sharp, a call not of alarm but of guidance, and Ethan followed, moving carefully along the narrow, leaf-littered path toward the old ridge where shadows hung between the trees like unfinished sentences. Each step seemed to pull the past closer, and the forest seemed alive with echoes of memory. The crackle of leaves underfoot, the soft rush of distant water, the faint creak of branches bending under the weight of moisture, and in the stillness, the sound of Blizzard's steady breathing, a heartbeat perfectly synchronized with Ethan's own. As they approached the ridge, the fog thinned slightly, revealing the contours of the land, the undulating rise and fall of terrain that had once been crossed under moonlight, with whispers of orders and soft patting of paws accompanying every movement, and Ethan realized that every detail, the glint of rain on leaves, the muted gold of dawn light, the faint smell of wet earth and pine resin, the steady, expectant gaze of Blizzard, was part of a tapestry designed to lead him forward, to ensure that when the moment of revelation came, it would not be missed, it would be seen in its full weight and significance. He paused at the top of the ridge, looking down over the slope where a faint trail led to a shallow hollow, and Blizzard pressed forward, nose low, tail high, eyes bright, the energy of anticipation vibrating in every taut muscle, and Ethan understood that they were on the threshold of understanding, of confirmation, of reunion not merely with memory, but with the living proof that fidelity and trust endure even when silence has lasted years, even when reports have declared loss, even when the world has moved on. The hollow at the bottom of the ridge revealed itself slowly through the thinning mist, a depression in the earth where the forest floor sloped gently, lined with ferns and moss that shone with the residue of overnight rain. Ethan Walker stepped carefully, boots sinking into the soft soil, each movement deliberate, conscious of every sound he made, while Blizzard padded ahead, nose low, tail flicking with subtle cues, ears swiveling to catch the faintest disturbances. The air was filled with the scent of wet leaves and pine, mingling with the earthy tang of exposed soil, and Ethan felt the pulse of the clearing, the rhythm of time layered over years of memory and quiet waiting. Blizzard stopped suddenly, body rigid, muscles coiled, and Ethan felt the small tension in the dog's stance as a silent signal to pay attention. He bent slightly, listening, hearing only the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle wind, yet sensing a presence, something waiting just beyond sight. Carefully, he followed Blizzard's gaze and saw the edges of another object, partially hidden beneath fallen branches, damp but deliberately covered, a texture unlike the surrounding earth. As he approached, the details became clear, a small crate, weathered and soaked, with subtle signs of prior use, its wood swollen from moisture yet intact, suggesting someone had placed it here with intention and care. Blizzard circled the crate, sniffing methodically, then stepped back, tilting his head, and Ethan understood that the dog was signaling readiness, an invitation to reveal what had been hidden. He knelt, hands brushing the wet leaves away, feeling the texture of the crate beneath his fingers, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were folded fabrics, weathered by time, and the unmistakable scent of canine, faint but distinct, and Ethan's pulse quickened, a wave of recognition washing over him as he identified the familiar warmth, the presence of life undiminished by the passage of years. Blizzard nudged forward, nose and paw in gentle insistence, guiding Ethan's hand to the fabrics, encouraging him to uncover, to see for himself. He did, revealing Blizzard's own blanket, folded and preserved, a small token left deliberately, perhaps as a bridge between absence and return. The amber eyes of Blizzard held Ethan's, communicating reassurance, trust, and the persistence of a bond that had never wavered. The crate also held a notebook, its pages damp but legible, filled with observations, sketches, and notes about movement, terrain, and care, written in careful script, evidence of a guardian who had watched over Blizzard when Ethan had been absent, maintaining connection across time and space. Each page turned carried the faint scent of pine and rain, the texture of ink pressed into paper, and Ethan read slowly, absorbing every line, feeling the dedication, the foresight, and the quiet devotion contained within. The wind shifted again, curling mist around their shoulders, and Ethan stood, crate in hand, eyes sweeping the clearing, taking in the faint outlines of the two crosses, the soft sway of branches, the damp leaf litter underfoot, the muted light reflecting off the mist and Blizzard's white coat, and a profound sense of presence settled over him, a convergence of past and present, of patience, loyalty, and unspoken promises fulfilled. Blizzard moved closer, body brushing Ethan's leg, tail sweeping in gentle arcs, and Ethan felt the warmth and weight of trust, unbroken and enduring, a living testament that guidance, fidelity, and quiet signals can bridge time, silence, and distance. He glanced down at the notebook again, then at Blizzard, and understood that the morning, the forest, the mist, the faint sunlight filtering through the oaks were all elements of a story unfolding beyond his control, yet entirely within his perception, a choreography of loyalty, attention, and quiet revelation. The creek murmured faintly below the ridge, the soft sound blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of birds, forming a backdrop that carried a sense of anticipation, grounding Ethan in the moment, reminding him that discovery and understanding often arrive not in dramatic gestures, but in patient observation, in listening, in following the subtle signs left by those we trust completely. Blizzard barked softly again, a single note that vibrated through the clearing, resonating in Ethan's chest, and he understood that this was the signal he had been waiting for, the cue to continue, to follow, to engage with the next layer of truth that the forest, the crates, the notebook, and the dog had prepared for him. With measured steps, he adjusted the weight of the crate, keeping Blizzard at his side, eyes never leaving the dog, and together they moved deeper into the hollow, mist curling around them, leaves soft beneath their feet, the air filled with the rich scent of pine, rain, and earth, carrying them forward into the unfolding clarity, guided by instincts refined through years, by trust built in silence, by a bond that had endured every season, every absence, every shadow of uncertainty. The mist thinned just enough to reveal the contours of the hollow more clearly, and Ethan Walker adjusted the crate in his arms, feeling its weight press against him like a subtle reminder that the truth they were uncovering was fragile, delicate, and yet immensely significant. Blizzard patted at his side, white fur gleaming softly in the diffuse morning light, ears twitching to catch the faintest whisper of sound carried on the wind, tail sweeping slowly with a patience that had been honed over years of service and trust. Ethan lowered the crate gently onto the moss-covered ground, brushing wet leaves from its surface, and felt the damp chill of the earth seep through his gloves as he knelt to examine its contents more closely. Inside, beneath layers of folded cloth, he found papers, notes, and small objects, each one bearing the faint patina of age and weather, the scent of rain-soaked canvas and pine needles clinging to every corner. He lifted the notebook carefully, pages damp but legible, and began to read, the words forming a story of careful observation, subtle guidance, and quiet endurance, a record left for someone who would come, someone who would understand the signals, the patterns, the trust that had been built over time. Blizzard sat back on his haunches, tail wrapped gently around his paws, eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that communicated not urgency, but the unspoken certainty that the path they were following was true, the signals authentic, and the moment for revelation approaching. The forest around them seemed to breathe and sync with them, the rustle of leaves, the gentle drip of water from branches, the distant murmur of a creek blending together into a subtle cadence that matched the rhythm of their movements. Ethan traced the notebook pages slowly, absorbing the handwriting, the sketches of terrain and paths, the notes of care taken to ensure safety and guidance, feeling the weight of every choice made and every moment observed. A faint beam of sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating the wet ground and glinting off the brass edge of a dog tag that lay nestled among the papers, a reminder that loyalty had persisted even when silence had filled the space between them. Blizzard lifted his head, ears alert, and gave a soft, low woof, and Ethan realized it was a prompt, a signal to look beyond the immediate, to follow the trail of evidence and attention laid out before him. He stood slowly, adjusting the weight of the crate, taking in the surrounding trees, the soft fog drifting between their trunks, the gentle incline of the hollow, and he felt the convergence of patience, observation, and fidelity that had brought them here. Each step he took toward the further edge of the hollow, following Blizzard's guidance, revealed more details: the flattened earth where paws had pressed, the faint outline of a path hidden beneath leaves, the subtle disturbance of soil that marked prior movement. And Ethan felt a thrill of anticipation, the kind that comes not from danger, but from the realization that discovery was within reach. Blizzard walked just ahead, nose low to the ground, muscles tensed in quiet concentration, and Ethan moved with him, attuned to every shift of weight, every slight pause, every look that the dog offered. The creek's faint gurgle reached their ears again, blending with the soft rustle of branches and the distant call of birds, and Ethan felt the clarity of the moment settle over him, the significance of each object, each sign, each patient observation coming together to form a cohesive understanding. He knelt again to examine another small object at the edge of the path, brushing away moss and debris, revealing a second collar, older, its leather softened by rain and time, the nameplate still readable, glinting faintly in the muted light. Ethan's fingers lingered on the brass, the weight of recognition pressing into him, and Blizzard pressed close, shoulder brushing against Ethan's side, a living anchor grounding him in the moment. The forest, the hollow, the mist, the creek, the papers, the collars, and the patient presence of Blizzard created a living tableau, a narrative of loyalty and trust unfolding before him. And Ethan understood fully that the journey had not been about a single object, a single proof, but about the pattern of care, observation, and constancy, the signals left behind by those who honored bonds that transcended time, absence, and silence. Blizzard barked softly once more, clear and deliberate, and Ethan followed the subtle cues forward, deeper into the hollow, into the quiet revelation that awaited them, feeling the convergence of past, present, and fidelity in every careful step, in every sniff of the dog's nose, in every droplet of rain that fell on the leaves and soil around them. And he knew that the moment of understanding was near, that loyalty and truth were guiding them toward their final, silent confirmation. The second collar lay in Ethan Walker's palm like a question that had waited years to be answered. Rainwater gathered along the brass plate, trembling there before falling in a single clear drop onto the moss below, and the name beneath his thumb slowly came into focus. Ranger. Ethan knew that name, too, not as a dog from his own unit, but from an old field report attached to Aaron Hayes, the Marine whose dog tag now rested in Ethan's pocket. Ranger had been Aaron's K9, a steady shepherd with a pale coat and a reputation for finding the way home through weather that made men lose direction. For a moment, Ethan could not hear the creek or the wind. He could only hear the quiet space between two names, Aaron and Ranger, Marine and dog, one pair from long ago, and now Ethan and Blizzard standing in the same hollow, as if history had folded back on itself. Blizzard stepped closer and pressed his nose to the old collar, not roughly, not with fear, but with the solemn gentleness of a dog acknowledging another life that had walked before him. Ethan closed his hand around the collar and whispered, "You found what they could not." Blizzard lifted his amber eyes, and the look in them was so calm that it almost broke Ethan's heart. The white K9 turned then, moving toward the far edge of the hollow where the creek narrowed between two shelves of stone. Ethan followed with the crate tucked under one arm and the old collar held carefully in his other hand. The ground grew softer near the water, and the air changed. It smelled colder there, touched by stone, fern, and running current. The creek was no wider than 12 feet, but it had carved a patient line through the forest floor, polishing the rocks smooth and dark. Blizzard stood at the bank, head lowered, listening. Ethan listened, too. Beneath the water's steady murmur came a faint sound, not a voice, not a cry, but a hollow tapping, rhythmic and gentle, as if something loose was moving under the small wooden footbridge ahead. The bridge was old, made of gray planks darkened by rain, just wide enough for one person to cross. Ethan stepped onto it carefully. The wood creaked under his weight, not breaking, only complaining like an old man awakened. Too early. Blizzard remained at the edge, watchful. Ethan crouched and looked beneath the bridge. There, wedged between a root and a stone, was a sealed metal case, half covered in mud and leaves, held in place by the slow pressure of water. He reached down, stretched carefully, and pulled it free. It came loose with a soft suctioning sound, heavier than he expected, its surface cold against his gloves. On the lid was a faded strip of tape, and on that tape, written in ink that had somehow survived the years, were 3 words: "Return to truth." Ethan carried the case back to the bank and set it beside Blizzard. The dog sniffed it once, then sat. No bark this time. No movement. Only waiting. Ethan opened the latches. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were photographs, weather logs, handwritten notes, and a small cassette recorder in a plastic sleeve. The sight of it made Ethan's breath catch. Old technology. Old evidence. Old voices. He picked up the recorder and saw that its batteries had long since failed, but the tape inside remained protected. Beside it was a folded letter sealed in a yellowing envelope. On the front, in the same careful handwriting as the notebook, it read, "To the Marine who follows the dog." Ethan felt the forest close around him, not threatening, but reverent. He opened the letter slowly. The paper crackled softly, and the words inside were plain, steady, written by Aaron Hayes himself. Ethan read in silence as the letter explained that Aaron had taken shelter near the old battlefield during a sudden mountain storm, that Ranger had found the hollow and refused to leave the area, that there were records hidden nearby, proving a mistake had been made in an old training incident, a mistake that had marked good men unfairly and left families without answers. Aaron had written that if he did not return, Ranger would try to lead someone back. The last line made Ethan stop breathing for a second. A loyal dog does not guard a grave. He guards the truth until someone worthy kneels to listen. Ethan lowered the letter. His eyes moved to Blizzard, who sat in the pale morning light, white coat damp, chest steady, gaze unwavering. Ethan understood then that Blizzard had not survived by accident, had not appeared beside the cross by chance, and had not barked simply to be found. Somewhere in the deep wisdom of dogs, in scent trails older than memory and loyalty stronger than orders, Blizzard had followed Ranger's unfinished path. He had found the place Aaron left behind. He had called Ethan there because Ethan would listen. The clouds parted slightly above the creek, and a thin seam of sunlight touched the bridge, the case, the old collar, and Blizzard's wet fur. Ethan placed Ranger's collar beside Aaron's letter and bowed his head for one quiet breath. "All right," he said softly. "We will bring it home." Blizzard stood then, and for the first time that morning, his tail moved with something almost like relief. Ethan Walker carried the metal case back through the hollow with the care of a man holding a sleeping child. The weight of it pulled at his arms, but the true weight was not metal or paper or old tape sealed away from weather. It was the silence around those things. It was the years those records had spent beneath a bridge while names faded, families waited, and the forest learned to keep secrets better than people did. Blizzard walked beside him, close enough that Ethan could feel the brush of damp white fur against his pant leg every few steps. The dog did not rush now. He seemed to understand that the discovery was no longer hidden, that the first hard door had opened, and that what came next required steadiness more than speed. The drizzle had softened into a fine mist, and by the time they reached the ridge again, sunlight was breaking through the clouds in pale gold ribbons, touching the wet leaves and turning every branch into something briefly luminous. Ethan paused near the old battlefield cross and set the case down at its base. The larger cross stood in silence, worn by seasons, while the smaller one near the trees seemed less lonely now, as though Aaron Hayes and Ranger had been waiting for someone to stand between them and say, "I see you." Ethan took out his phone. There was only one bar of service, weak and flickering, but it was enough. He called the county sheriff first, then the Veterans Affairs office that had handled older missing service member files, then a retired chaplain named Paul Mercer, one of the few men Ethan still trusted with things too sacred to explain over a phone. His voice stayed low and controlled as he gave the location, the markings on the case, the dog tag number, and the name Aaron Hayes. On the other end, there were pauses. Long ones. The kind that told Ethan people were sitting up straighter, reaching for paper, realizing that an old closed file had just begun breathing again. Blizzard sat beside the cross while Ethan made the calls. He watched the tree line, not anxious, not restless, simply present, his amber eyes bright against the soft morning light. Less than an hour later, the first vehicles arrived along the old access road half a mile away, their tires crunching over gravel and wet leaves. Sheriff Daniel Reeves came on foot with 2 deputies, all of them quiet as they entered the clearing. Behind them was Chaplain Mercer, now 72, his silver hair tucked beneath an old wool cap, his face lined with the solemn kindness of someone who had spent a lifetime standing near grief without trying to hurry it. He stopped when he saw the crosses. Then he saw Blizzard. The chaplain removed his cap. No one told him to. The gesture rose from him naturally, as if the place itself had asked for respect. Ethan handed him Aaron's dog tag first. Mercer held it in both hands, his lips parting as though he had recognized a voice from far away. "I knew his mother," he said softly. "She never stopped asking." The words settled over the clearing with more force than any shout could have carried. Sheriff Reeves opened the metal case only after photographing it in place. Every movement was careful. Every item was documented. The photographs, the weather logs, the handwritten notes, the cassette recorder, the letter addressed to whoever followed the dog. As the sheriff read the first pages, his expression changed from professional focus to something quieter, something almost wounded. Not because the truth was dramatic, but because it was simple. A storm, a misfiled report, a wrong assumption repeated until it became history. Men who had done their duty but were remembered under a cloud of uncertainty they had not earned. Families who had lived for years with unanswered questions because no one had walked deep enough into the forest and listened to the dog who knew the way. Ethan stood apart while they worked, one hand resting on Blizzard's neck. The dog leaned into him, warm and steady, and Ethan felt his own breathing slow. He had imagined truth as a thunderclap. Instead, it came like dawn. Gradual, gentle, impossible to stop once it began. By afternoon, the drizzle was gone. The clearing smelled of sunlit moss and wet cedar. Chaplain Mercer knelt beside the smaller cross and placed Ranger's collar there, not as evidence now, but as honor. Sheriff Reeves promised that Aaron's family would be contacted before sunset and that the records would go to the proper military investigators with every page preserved. Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed on Blizzard. The white K9 had done what no file had done. He had carried memory through scent, silence, and instinct, through a path first walked by another loyal dog years before. When the officials finally stepped back, the clearing grew still again. Ethan knelt beside Blizzard and pressed his forehead gently against the dog's. No speech came easily. None was needed. Blizzard gave one soft breath, then rested his chin on Ethan's shoulder. In that quiet wait, Ethan felt the whole morning gather itself into grace. The cross, the case, the old names, the living dog, the promise brought home. Some truths do not rise because men demand them. Some rise because loyalty keeps standing guard until mercy finally arrives. By sunset, the old battlefield clearing no longer felt forgotten. A narrow path of footprints had softened the wet leaves between the access road and the crosses, but no one had disturbed the quiet more than necessary. Sheriff Daniel Reeves and his deputies had left with the metal case sealed in a marked evidence bag, the cassette recorder wrapped separately, the weather logs protected between stiff sheets of paper, and Aaron Hayes's letter carried like something sacred. Chaplain Paul Mercer remained behind for a while, standing near the smaller cross with his hands folded in front of him, his wool cap pressed against his chest, his eyes lowered not in sadness alone, but in gratitude. Ethan Walker stood a few steps away with Blizzard at his side, watching the last light slide through the trees. The sky had cleared in the west, and the clouds above the ridge were edged in copper and soft purple, the kind of evening color that made even old scars seem less harsh. The air smelled of wet cedar, cooling stone, and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves underfoot. Blizzard was tired now. Ethan could feel it in the way the dog leaned against his leg, not weakly, but with the honest heaviness of a loyal body finally allowed to rest. The white fur along his shoulders had dried in uneven waves, and a few dark flecks of mud clung to his paws like small marks of the journey he had completed. Ethan lowered his hand and let his fingers settle gently into Blizzard's coat. No command, no correction, just touch. Chaplain Mercer turned toward them, his lined face softened by the fading light. "There are families who wait so long," he said quietly, "that waiting becomes part of their name." Ethan looked toward the smaller cross. Ranger's collar rested there now, beside a folded scrap of clean cloth Mercer had placed under it, so the old leather would not sit directly in the mud. Will they know by tonight? Ethan asked. Mercer nodded. Aaron's sister is still living in Virginia. The office reached her. She cried before they finished the sentence. The words moved through Ethan slowly, not like shock, like a bell ringing somewhere far away, sending its sound across water. Blizzard lifted his head at the chaplain's voice, then looked back toward the trees, ears relaxed, eyes calm. He had no understanding of paperwork, investigations, or official corrections, but he understood release. He understood when a burden in the air had changed. He understood that the humans around him were standing differently now, with shoulders lowered and voices softened, as if the forest had taught them how to speak. Ethan thought of Aaron Hayes' letter, of that last line about a loyal dog guarding the truth. He thought of Ranger Crossing. This hollow years before, nose to the ground, refusing to let the story end in confusion. Then he thought of Blizzard, white as winter light, finding the buried signs and calling Ethan forward with one bark strong enough to break years of silence. 2 dogs, 2 Marines, one unfinished promise carried through time by paws that never asked for credit. The first stars appeared above the treetops. Chaplain Mercer stepped close and placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. You did right today. Ethan shook his head gently. He did. The chaplain looked down at Blizzard and smiled with wet eyes. Then both of you did. No one said anything after that. The clearing did not need more words. A few minutes later, Mercer walked back toward the access road, leaving Ethan and Blizzard alone beside the crosses. The wind stirred the branches overhead, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the creek continued its patient song over stone. Ethan knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the damp earth. Blizzard stepped into him at once, pressing his chest against Ethan's shoulder, and Ethan wrapped both arms around the dog's neck, careful, firm, full of the tenderness he had carried for years but rarely shown. You brought him home, Ethan whispered. Blizzard gave a soft breath against his cheek. Ethan closed his eyes. In that breath, he heard no mystery, no command, no warning. Only peace. When he stood again, the last sunlight had fallen directly across the 2 crosses, the old one and the small one, joining them in a single band of gold. Ethan lifted Ranger's collar once, then set it back with Aaron's tag beside it, both resting in the glow. Blizzard sat beside him, tall and quiet, his white coat shining softly in the dusk. The forest held them there for a final moment, not as witnesses to loss, but as witnesses to grace. Then Ethan turned toward the path home, and Blizzard followed at his left side without being told. Behind them, the crosses remained under the evening sky, no longer markers of silence, but proof that mercy can wait in hidden places, that truth can sleep beneath leaves and rain, and that sometimes God sends the answer not in thunder, not in fire, but in one faithful bark from a dog who never forgot the way.